If you've experienced something unbelievably weird and unexplainable that left you feeling isolated and afraid, the Paranormal PTSD Recovery Podcast is for you. Each week, we go from haunting to healing by focusing on one of our three core focal points: personal stories, healing tips, and understanding the unknown. We help you to know that you're not crazy, you're not alone, and you can heal. Now here's your hostess, Laura Giles. Howdy, guys. Today we're talking about Britain's Roswell, the incident at Rendlesham Forest. And one of the things we do on this podcast is ask what's going on with paranormal phenomenon. And this case is definitely one of the most documented and most mysterious. And my guest today is Gary Heseltine. If you're curious about the alien phenomenon, you probably already know Gary. He's the editor of UFO Truth magazine, the vice president of the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, composed of scientists, academics, and leading UFO UAP researchers worldwide, and the author of Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents. Thanks for being here, Gary.
You're welcome at any time.
So can you give us a brief version of the Rendlesham Forest UAP incident for those who've not heard of it?
Yeah, it's not really so easy to do, but I'll try because I say in my book that it's the most, in my opinion, it's the most complicated UFO case in history. But here goes. Basically, what you have is two American US Air Force bases about 80 miles north of London on what's called the east coast of the UK. And in the middle of, between the two US bases, there is a forest called Rendlesham Forest, literally about 3 miles apart, the twin bases. And during a period which I now believe is approximately 1 week in late December 1980, there were numerous observations, interactions with what can only be described as non-human intelligence, some kind of UFO activity. On at least 17 occasions, there were different events, timed events, over that last week period of December 1980, involving numerous, predominantly US Air Force security police. And in amongst those 17, there's at least two that where life forms stroke entities are seen that suggest that there was some intelligence behind this activity. How's that?
That is a great synopsis. It is difficult to kind of put it all in a box, and you did that great. So when you said 17 incidents over a week, a lot of the reports say that it was over 2 days and only focus on certain incidents. Why do you think that is?
Well, no, it's just the nature of the way the story has emerged, along with what I think is some deliberate cover-up by aspects of the US Air Force trying to play down certain incidents and say that they never occurred. Don't forget that this case now is now over 43 years old, 44 years old, obviously in December. So it's a long time ago. And originally, the first thing that really emerged in terms of worldwide coverage was a big newspaper headline in a British tabloid newspaper called The News of the World that was printed on the 2nd of October 1983, and that had a headline, UFO lands in Suffolk, it's official. And the it's official bit pointed down to a little section of what turned out to be a hitherto unknown secret US Air Force document, which is now referred to as the Holt Memorandum. And this one-page US Air Force headed memorandum, it was not a report, it was just a memorandum. It basically said that there'd been two incidents. One on the morning, the dates were wrong, by the way, in that memorandum, allegedly. That's another story in itself, but the dates were wrong, but we now believe that it was the first night of activity for many years believed to be the first night in activity, was the night of Christmas night, overnight into Boxing Day morning, the 26th. And this is where a small triangular craft, can only be a structured craft as described by Sergeant Jim Penniston, landed in a small clearing in the forest that was approximately 3 meters by 3 meters in height, in width, and about 2 meters in height at its highest point. And this object was like glass, black glass. It was fairly warm to the touch, and it had raised etchings on certain part and certain symbols. That was described by Sergeant Penniston. Close by, approximately 20, 30 metres further back, was another airman who was with him called Airman John Burroughs. And from his vantage point, he didn't describe it as a black triangular craft. He basically described it as a bank of lights that was so bright that suggested there was a structure behind it. So different perceptions from different locations. His perception, maybe 30 meters away, is slightly different. Jim Penniston says he walked around it, touched it, he saw it clearly. So that was what appears in the memo, and that was not that was admitted essentially by the US Air Force, that an unknown object had landed of that size and dimensions. Now, what you talk about a second incident, this again comes from the memorandum from 1983 in that article, and this was the memorandum was written by the then Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, and he was the one that wrote this 3-paragraph memo. First paragraph basically said there'd been a landing on what was then deemed to be the first night, and then the second paragraph was a short paragraph about the fact that indentations in the ground in a triangular formation had been found, 3 depressions in a perfectly triangle, equilateral triangle, to the same size and weight of depression, and giving measurements. The third paragraph was perhaps the most interesting for me, because Colonel Holt, he finished as retired as a colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Holt, he basically said that 2 nights later he was called out into the forest because, again, there had been further reports of UFO activity, and so he took a small team out into the forest, and whilst they were at the original landing site from 2 days earlier, they then saw strange lights in the sky themselves. And so it ends up in that third paragraph where he says, and I saw multiple UFOs myself, and he signed it. So there aren't many lieutenant colonels who've gone on the record to say they've seen multiple UFOs at relative close proximity. And don't forget that whilst it was never admitted to by Colonel Holt or the base commander, Colonel Williams, I have documentation that proves that this was a nuclear base. The RAF Bentwaters, one of the twin bases, was a nuclear base for tactical nuclear weapons that could be attached to aircraft in the event of Soviet aggression. Because don't forget, this occurs during the Cold War. It's still the Cold War, the era of the Soviet Union. And so basically, that's where you're thinking there were only 2 incidents, because that had a lot of attention to it. It went worldwide. There's been loads of documentaries. But what's emerged over the years is more and more bits and pieces. And so when I did my book, I first got involved in Rendlesham publicly in December of 2007, when I met Lieutenant Colonel Holt, then a retired colonel, for a History Channel documentary, which was part of what was called the series called UFO Hunters, with Bill Burns as the host. And so that ran for 3 seasons. So that was in the first season of that series, and they were coming over to the UK, and they were coming over to interview me about my police database. I have an unofficial national database for UK police officers to report sightings. So that's how I didn't originally become known in the subject. And they said, "Oh, we're coming over to interview you for that." I said, "Are you coming over to do anything else?" And they said, "Yeah, we're going to do Rendlesham Forest." And I said, "Well, I'm interested in Rendlesham Forest." I said, "Because I was in the Royal Air Force, and for 3 of my 6 years, as a Royal Air Force police officer, I worked in guarding nuclear weapons, basically doing the same job as what the US Air Force Security Police had done. And I said, I think there's more witnesses that can be found, because I'm sure there are going to be other reports that could emerge through further investigation. And they said, okay, come along, we'll introduce you to the colonel, and you'll be filmed as part of the series. So that's where I first get involved. Where, in terms of my book didn't happen, and I never planned to write a book, but I got invited to work on a documentary called Capel Green that's set, I believe, to come out this year after 7 years of production. Much too long for me, but there you go. It's going to come out, I'm told, later this year. And they asked me to be the lead researcher. And I thought, well, if I'm going to put my name to it, I best be accurate about everything that I'm saying. And so I then decided to do a reinvestigation, like a cold case review. Now, for what many of your listeners will realise is that I spent 6 years in the Royal Air Force Police and then had a 24-year career in the police, the British police. And I ended up, through design, being a detective for the last 19 years of my service. And so I became a specialist interviewer of suspects and witnesses, and that was my particular interest. I liked interviewing people. And so I thought, okay, I've got this documentary, I'm going to do a reinvestigation. That reinvestigation was probably the most thorough one done to date, and it took 5 years, and then the book took 3 years. And it's only later when that it was actually my then wife who suggested, well, you've got so much material as part of the reinvestigation, why don't you write a book? And I said, well, no, that's quite a good idea, because it was never all going to appear in the documentary. There simply was too much. But cutting a long story short, in the process of writing, doing the reinvestigation, I interviewed new people. I was able to track down some people that were known in the story but had not been interviewed for many years, or had been very reluctant to be interviewed, or some that had been interviewed originally that I thought I might be able to re-interview them in light of my investigative training in terms of interviewing, to see if I could get more information. And indirectly that happened, and I was able to obtain some incredible new testimony from two people in particular. One was called, well, three people in particular. One was called Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. Another was called former Airman Steve Longero. And another one was a former airman called Michael Stacey Smith. And each of those had amazing new information that had never been known about the case. And I tried to, with two of them, Adrian Bustinza and Steve Longero, to use an advanced interviewing technique that I'd been taught in the police. And it's not designed to work 40 odd years after the event, but it's basically on concentration and getting the subject to feel relaxed, and then hand the interview over to them, and then not interrupt them at all when they first start speaking. And that actually worked, and I ended up doing a 4.5 hour interview, transatlantic phone call with Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, a 3.5 hour interview with them and Steve Longero. And that technique worked on those two people, and they retrieved a lot more information than they'd ever mentioned before. Suffice to say that Sergeant Adrian Bustinza corroborated the most controversial aspect of the whole case. Originally, a 19-year-old airman called Larry Warren was the first person to actually put his name to the case and say, I was there, and here is my name, Larry Warren. Everybody else, for many years, was seen darkened out, names not mentioned, and they're all pseudonyms. Well, he became the original military whistleblower because he went public and said, here is my name. And for about 8 years, he was on his own, from, say, 1983 up to about 1991, in the public eye. He was the recognised person. But his story differed completely from that was contained in the memorandum. He basically had said that he was out at a minor security post on the fringes of one of the bases, and he was told to close his little security place down, and he would get picked up, and then he would be taken into the forest. Now, he did that. He closed his post down. Truck pulled up and said, "Get in." He gets in. He thinks it's some kind of exercise, and then he's taken to this location deep in Rendlesham Forest, which he'd never been into. And he eventually finds himself walking through the forest with many other security police officers, and he gets to the edge of what we now refer to as the farmer's field. And in the farmer's field, he stands at the edge and he sees that there is a strange glowing mist on the ground in the middle of this, what was then a cow field, that was surrounded by approximately 14, 15 fellow US Air Force security police officers. And he still thinks, what the hell is going on? Is this some kind of an exercise? But this period of this mist that he describes is kind of yellowish green, but it's only 1-2 feet off the ground, and it's approximately 50 feet in diameter in a kind of circular patch. Well, fog doesn't behave in that kind of way. So anyway, he is then told to join the cordon around this strange mist, fog, whatever you want to call it, and he does so. And then he said he hears somebody over the radio saying, "Here it comes." And he looks and he sees a small basketball-sized object, red glowing object, come from the direction of the North Sea, which was approximately 4 miles away. And he then stops and hovers above the yellow mist. So it comes to a stop. And then all of a sudden there's an explosion of light. Everybody rubs their eyes and blinded by the light. And then when their eyes refocus, he says there was a shimmering, translucent craft approximately 30 feet across, kind of like delta shape, wedge shape. And it was on the ground where the mist had been. Very bizarre. It sounds like science fiction. And it gets even crazier, because he then said that as he's watching, a group of senior officers, U.S. Air Force security senior officers, turn up, and he said one of them was, well, two of them were Colonel Charles Holt, then a lieutenant colonel, and he said the base commander who was responsible for 12,000 personnel turned up, Colonel Gordon Williams, the top man. And they entered the field and they walked towards this shimmering, translucent craft. And here it gets really bizarre, because he said then what happened was like a bubble slipped off the side of the craft, not through a doorway, not through a window, etc. And this bubble then separated into 3 bubbles. And then within the upper within each of the 3 bubbles, there was the upper torso of what we would now describe as some kind of alien grey that almost looked like children in like white, kind of very, very white, like a ghostly type figure. And these 3 entities, for whatever you want to call them, are hovering beside, floating beside the craft. There is then a silent face-off meeting between the 3 entities and the base commander and other senior officers. No words are exchanged, nothing audible can be heard, but it looks like there's a silent face-off. Now, it sounds like pure science fiction, but it gets even crazy, because he said on the side, to one side, there were 2 cameras. One was a cine camera on a tripod, and one was an early video camera. And we checked for the documentary, there were early video cameras around at that time, especially by the Americans, because they were ahead technologically of what was available in the UK. So that's all very weird. And he said there were also two British police officers. You think of British police officer in the uniform with the big helmet. Now, they'd have had flat caps, but the black uniform would have been there. And he said they were at the edge of the field taking still photographs. Now, that was the original account he gave. And he was in the public domain for the first 8 years or so. And so that was another aspect that clearly didn't match what Colonel Holt had said, clearly didn't match what Sergeant Adrian, Sergeant Jim Penniston had said. Now, when I interviewed Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, he had over the years made sporadic minor comments about the case, but he had been very traumatized by what he'd experienced. He was religious, and it had affected his faith, and thrown lots of things up into the air. So when I interviewed him, eventually he said, 3.5 hours into this interview, 3.5 hours into the last hour, he then said, yes, Larry Warren was there. I was stood beside him in the field. This happened. It was being filmed. There were security officers around it, etc. Colonel Holt had the British policeman's cameras confiscated, and I took them off and put them into a bag and gave them to Colonel Holt. Colonel Williams, the base commander, was there. So he more or less corroborated everything. Now, the slight difference was that he didn't like to say anything about the entities because it really had affected him. What he'd seen really profoundly affected him. And what he would say was there were kind of life forms, entities. There was some form of life there. That's the way he phrased it. But essentially, it corroborated this controversial account completely. And this was unheard of. Nobody expected to get that total corroboration, but it was almost blow by blow corroboration. So that was really interesting.
Have you encountered the unexplainable? Do the shadows of the paranormal haunt your days and nights? You are not alone. Join our Paranormal PTSD recovery group, a safe haven where you can share your experiences, seek understanding, and begin to heal. Here, we believe your story. Together, we'll uncover the truth and find peace. Don't suffer in silence. Click on the link in the show notes to join and start healing today.
Now, also in the course of talking to him earlier in that first interview, he'd actually mentioned another incident that he'd been involved in that nobody knew about. That's in the book, one of the 17 incidents. So this is kind of absolutely fresh territory. And he basically said that he'd got into the forest earlier. His job that night was what's called NCOIC, and he was basically at a roving mobile patrol. He was the gopher. Somebody said, go get me this, go get me that. He would go off and get it off from one of the bases and then bring it back into the forest. So he was a bit of a gopher. So he had a robe. So he went into the forest several times on one of these nights of activity. And on one of these nights of the activity, he said that he was asked to form a search line of approximately 20 US Air Force security police officers. If you think of conventional homicide or something like that, and you're looking for, say, a knife near to a house or where the suspect has been, it's been discarded. The police will often form a long single line, and then they'll go forward slowly, all together, looking down at the ground, trying to see if they can recover any evidence or find the knife in that example. Well, effectively, he was told to do the same and form a line of approximately 20 US Air Force security police officers that were walking through the forest. So between the trees, moving forward together. Now, they weren't really shoulder to shoulder. They were maybe 10 meters apart. So this actually stretches out in a long line of maybe 200 meters, sir. But he's going forward through the forest. Now, this is before we think the incident that I've just recounted, where the entities were seen. So this is something completely earlier. This is maybe a day earlier, something like that. It doesn't appear to be the same incident at all. So this is what he's saying. And he said he went out in this line. And at one point, he said he tripped because it's very dark. There's no lights. All they had was a torch, and you're going through undergrowth. And he tripped. And he says, as he fell, he said he fell, and as he got back up to stand back up, he realised that he'd fallen under some kind of strange mist, because as he was on the ground looking up, it was like he was underwater, and he could see a film layer that's like 3 feet above him, above the ground. So he looks up and sees that he's underneath this kind of layer of mist. So that was weird. So he stands up, carries on walking. The other people then start to get a bit disorientated. And then the next thing he says, we see a UFO moving through the trees. And then he says, we walk a bit further, and then we see a group of UFOs, 7, 8 of them, all whizzing around the sky, making angular patterns. So this was, again, unheard of. And this is not somebody who is, I don't think, prone to make up stories. Why is he going to do this? But he really got into the zone and recounted this incident. So again, totally unknown. So his incidents, what made it fascinating during that 4.5 hours interview was I was trying to work out what I knew of the story and then kind of match it to it. But I'm thinking, I've never heard of this. Nobody's ever mentioned this line of 20. So that was completely new. So that's a different event. However much you struggle for the timeline, you're never really going to get it after all these years. But here he was offering a new insight into another incident that had never been mentioned. So again, a different timed event. It's a question of when, what day, what date, as it were. So that and the other one where he said he'd been in the field. And then he said he'd had one more experience, which I did know that he'd had, but we didn't really know much in the public domain about what had happened. And he said that on the night that Holt had been out with his team in the forest, yeah, that's mentioned in the memorandum, he was actually one of the 4 other people with Holt that went out into the forest. All the other Air Force security police officers had been told to stay back at what was called the staging area, where all the vehicles had to stop when everybody got into the forest, because the forest stopped, the path into the forest stopped, so all the trucks had to stop. And so this became like a meeting area where everybody gathered. But he was a part of Holt's original team that went out into the forest. So he does that. He's out walking around. They see UFOs. They come back. So that was part of Holt's story. And here was the extra bit that we knew a little bit of, but not much detail. And he said that after they'd been out walking through the forest, they go back to the staging area and he sees an airman called John Burroughs, the same John Burroughs who was with Sergeant Jim Penniston on what we thought was the first night, this small triangular craft. And he said he'd been off duty, but he'd heard on the grapevine that something was happening in the forest, and he'd managed to get a lift to the bases because he didn't drive. And he got to the staging area where everybody had to stop and gather, and he was asking for permission to go forward into the forest and join up with Holt. Now, Holt had said, no, you'll have to wait. So eventually, when they come back after 4.5 hours, he approaches then Lieutenant Colonel Holt and said, can I go back out into the forest? And he said, yeah, okay, you go and we're going back. And so John Burroughs says to Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who'd just come back after 4.5 hours, and said, will you come with me? And for whatever reason, Bustinza says, yeah, I'll come out for a few minutes with you. He felt compelled. John Burroughs felt compelled to go into the forest. Didn't know why. So anyway, they go off from the staging area, and apparently the location is not exactly nailed down, but it's close to the edge of the field, the farmer's field. So that could be an area anywhere 400 or 500 meters long. Yeah, because it's quite a lot big field. So he says that John Burroughs is in front of me, walking along through the undergrowth near to the field. And then suddenly he said, I feel as if I'm pushed from behind by an unseen force. And he falls to the ground. And as he falls forward onto his hands, he then sees John, who is approximately 20 meters in front of him, suddenly engulfed in an incredible bright white light. So much so that he can't really see clearly what's going on. But that beam of light, within that beam of light, he says there was some kind of figure, moving figure, to the left of John Burroughs. And then he said John Burroughs was about 6'6", so you couldn't miss him. There was another figure, smaller, on the right side moving. So there was like a figure on either side of John Burroughs lit up within this glowing white light. And he said, so that was his second encounter with some kind of life form. And interestingly, part of that beam of light struck Adrian Bustinza while he was on the ground. And part of it touched his hand and his groin area. And to this day, he has rashes that are non-life threatening, but he's had a mark and a persistent rash ever since. So again, a kind of weird effect from that. But that was, again, further detail padding out that we knew little bits of the story. Okay, so let's move on to Steve Longero. Steve Longero, I interviewed him for about 3.5 hours, transatlantic call, costing me a fortune. And he was known historically, briefly, had been mentioned in a book called Left at East Gate, a book on Rendlesham Forest, written by the original military whistleblower Larry Warren, and the co-author Peter Robbins. And that had been a very successful book. And that one came out about 1997, I think the first version of that, the first edition. And it was a good book. And basically, his name had been mentioned, but there really hadn't been much else. It was only briefly. And then I became aware of an interview that a British researcher had done called Philip Mantle. Suddenly popped up on the internet, and after many years, Steve Longero had given this interview. And it was fairly brief, but it suggested to me when I read it that he knew a lot more. It just had a few things up in the air that I thought, well, I wonder if I try that technique on him, he might remember more. So I asked Philip Mantle for his email, Steve Longero's email, which he kindly gave me, and then I contacted him, and eventually we arranged a time and we do this transatlantic call. And he had just got to a gym, intending to have a gym session in the States somewhere, and then suddenly he gets right into it, doesn't do the gym session, and because I've set the interview up in a certain way, he really wanted to, like a cathartic experience, tell his story. So he kind of starts all pouring out of him, and that's what makes it really good, and that's where you get a lot of fresh information. And he basically said a couple of incredible things. The first one was that there'd been rumors for many years that a UFO had shone a beam down into the nuclear bunkers of the weapons storage area, RAF Bentwaters. But there'd never been any direct witnesses. It'd always been rumours. Colonel Holt at one point said while he was out in the forest looking for UFOs, blah, 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 he'd seen way off in the distance a beam being shone by a UFO in what he thought was the direction of the weapons storage area. But he was geographically a long way away, so it was never confirmed. And what he tells me, to my surprise, is that actually he was inside the nuclear weapons storage area, WSA. And it was this nuclear weapons storage area, which they don't admit to, but it was. I've got documents to prove it. And basically, he said he'd already arrived at the base a few weeks earlier, fresh from training. And because he was so new, he was tasked with walking around inside the weapons storage area with an experienced airman who'd worked on there a long time. So he knew what the procedures were. So in a sense, the experienced airman was shadowing him, all right, telling him what to do. And basically, all it was a roving foot patrol within the perimeter of this relatively small area, the most sensitive area on the entire twin base complex, because it held nuclear weapons. And what it had was a set of bunkers that was approximately 300-400 meters long. So, like if you think of one long row of bunkers, military bunkers, metal doors, covered in soil, blah, blah, blah. And he was basically just walking around inside as a walking foot patrol. There were mobile patrols, security patrols as well in this area, but he was on a foot patrol with this experienced airman. And he said that as they were walking around, he saw UFO nearby, hovering over some nearby forest trees, but just above the treetop level, and then it shone a beam down directly into the bunkers at one end. Yeah, so imagine akin to a laser beam going down into the bunkers. Now, this is the most secure facility on the base. And it starts doing this. It starts doing a pendulum search of all the bunkers. And it goes along steadily down the complete row, working its way down as if it's like scanning. And that's what he actually said. He felt it was scanning the contents of what was in those bunkers. All right. So this is pretty profound. And now we have a direct witness. So he said that. Now, the beam's on while it scans all the way down the hot row, as it's called, the hot row. And then when it gets to the end, it then turns off the beam, and the UFO then goes out over towards Rendlesham Forest. Okay? So it leaves the base and it heads out towards the Rendlesham Forest. And he can hear people on the radio tracking it. Now, what's really bizarre then, and what would never happen normally, is that he is then told to go back to the command facility that's within just outside the weapon storage area. So he is then told, you're getting relieved from your post, because in a sense he was supernumerary. He was an extra, just doing his basic training. And he was told to get in a truck, and he got taken out to the forest. Now, he goes out into the forest, and he said, we are then taken to the original landing site where the 3 depressions were. And he said that whilst we're there, we see multiple UFOs as well. So he has a sighting with another 10 or 15 others. So again, this is an entirely 2 new events that we weren't even aware of, part of this 17 different timed events. Obviously, the timeline's a bit all over the place. We can't be specific, but these are real experiences, and they're not said in any jest. People are very affected by what they saw. And afterwards, there were, which we can talk about later, there were many, about 5 or 6 of them were subjected to a lot of interrogations because they'd seen things that they probably shouldn't have seen. Wrong place, wrong time. So he comes out with that. So again, we have 2 major events that's emerged from his interview. A direct witness to the nuclear beam and the scanning of the bunkers, and also this other incident where he'd been out in the forest and seen multiple UFOs with many others. Totally unknown. So this is why this is many, many more incidents. And then perhaps one of the biggest revelations to emerge comes from the partial testimony of a former airman called Michael Stacey Smith. Now, Michael Stacey Smith was an interesting character in his own because he'd had an earlier sighting earlier in 1980. And one of the things that had never been chronicled properly was, which I did for the book, was that there'd been at least 4 fairly prominent sightings throughout 1980 leading up to that event in late December. So they are part of the story for me because it says that UFOs were interested in the twin bases and the forest in the vicinity. So they're all part of the story. So he had one himself, a sighting of his own, where he'd seen a red basketball object close to the perimeter fence, and he called for backup. 2 airmen had come out, one of which ran towards him, and one of which ran towards the glowing ball that was on the outside of the perimeter fence, just moving along silently, about 2 feet in diameter. And he had a big M60 machine gun. If you think of Rambo and the original posters for Rambo and the big machine gun, that's what they had. He had an M60, and he said he cocked it, and he said, I was ready to fire at it, because if that object had interacted or caused any harm to the airman that had ran towards the fence and approaching it, I would have opened fire. So that's pretty big in itself. Again, another little caveat to this very complicated story. So that's had already happened, and that had all been noted. But what he said afterwards was what's the real good bit to emerge. And I said to him, you obviously, thank you for that. Have you had any other experiences involving unknown objects on the base or in the forest or on the twin bases? And he said, yes. And I said, well, tell me about that then. And he then goes on to recount what turns out to be arguably one of the biggest cover-ups of the entire Rendlesham story. And you probably haven't heard of this unless you've read the book. Well, there was at the time, there were 4 shifts of security police that worked 365 days, 24/7, guarding nuclear weapons, in simple terms. One of the shift commanders was a young black female officer called Bonnie Tamplin, Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. And she was really well thought of. She was really good at what she did, very popular with all the airmen and airwomen that were there. They were still called airmen, by the way, even if you're a woman. Don't ask me why. But politically incorrect as it was. But anyway, she was very popular. And I think she'd have only been in her early 30s, but very popular. Now, what happened was, during one of these nights of activity, the story that we did know over the years was that something dramatic had happened to her, because people had gone on the record to say they'd heard her over the radio, screaming over the radio, help, help, help. She'd encountered something, but we didn't know what. And there were conflicting stories about what it was. Well, until Michael Stacey Smith came along, we didn't have any direct evidence about what had happened. Well, he said, well, I knew some of what happened to her. So I said, tell me what it was. And he said, well, at the time, I was at RAF Bentwaters, and then suddenly in the area, in the US Air Force Security Police building at Bentwaters, and he's told to suddenly and urgently go open up the back gate of RAF Bentwaters, which is called the Butley Gate. The Butley Gate. It was just a little gate at the back of the perimeter where it just led out onto a little country road, and it was a back country road to what was RAF Woodbridge, approximately 3-4 miles away. Okay, so he gets told, get there, open up the Butley Gate, and stand by for further information. So he rushes down there, opens up the gate, and then within minutes, a convoy of 3 or 4 security police vehicles all go rushing out through the back gate. And he doesn't know why, but he's just following orders. Well, what happened was, about 10 minutes later, he sees a vehicle coming back, one of the convoy coming back. He opens up the gate, and then he realizes that in the passenger seat is Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin. But she's not looking like she normally did. She's disheveled, she's not wearing a beret, she's crying, she's shaking. Something clearly had traumatized her. Didn't know why, didn't know what. Off she goes through the gate, being driven in. He's thinking, I don't know what's going on here, but that's clearly Lieutenant Tamplin, and she looks terrible. Then about 10 minutes later, another vehicle comes back, and this turns out to be Lieutenant Tamplin's vehicle. Now, she'd responded to a call over the radio to investigate something going down into the forest. A young airman, actually a female called Laurie Bowen, had been at RAF Woodbridge backgate and said, I'd just seen a red glowing object descend into the forest. She'd reported it. It'd gone out the radio. Is there anybody that can attend Rendlesham Forest? Information that an object's gone down into the forest. Then I might be thinking aircraft crash or whatever. And it turns out that she'd just randomly happens to be on mobile patrol en route from RAF Bentwaters along this back country lane, public road, towards RAF Woodbridge. So she's on a British public road, rural public road. And then all of a sudden, this comes over the edge. She says, yeah, I'll attend. And then the next minute, people are hearing her screaming, help, help, help. Okay, so it's clearly in that kind of timeline, but we didn't know what had happened. So Michael Stacey Smith partly tells the story because 10 minutes later, after that, she's come in looking all dishevelled and upset. This vehicle turns up and it's got roof damage, as if part of the roof has crumpled. It's rolled on its side and sustained. It's gone into a ditch and it's rolled, blah, blah. He's thinking, what's going on? And it turns out that that was her vehicle. Okay, so in that comes. And he then is told to close the gate up. And he was so curious, he went to one of the friends that he had who was a sergeant and said, well, what's happened to her? And the sergeant said, well, I'm only going to tell you this if you never reveal my name, because it was obviously very sensitive information. And he said, yeah, I promise I'll never really reveal your name. And he never revealed it to me, but I've no reason to think that he's going to make this up. And the sergeant said, she's on the country road when apparently Tamkelin had seen a red glowing object the size of a car pull alongside of her. Now, if you imagine driving along a rural country road at hedgerow height, this object is running parallel with her. So she's going down down, and on the left side there is this object hovering, and she basically is so frightened by what she's seen, she loses control of the vehicle and she goes into a ditch. The vehicle rolls over. Fortunately, she's not hurt but shaken up. She crawls out only to find that the red glowing object is hovering above her. Now, she is so frightened by what she's seen, she picks up her weapon, because they all were live armed and carried weapons, and starts shooting at it, bang, 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 as you would. And then the object goes away at speed. And at that point, she's on the radio going, help, help, help. So that then fills in the blanks. Now, it's a very serious thing to discharge your weapon in the military. It's not something that it can lead you. It can get you kicked out. What's called a negligent discharge and whatever, or firing without the right rules of engagement. So all of that was covered up. She left a weapon when she got picked up, and that had to be picked up. All the bullets that she'd fired, however many it was, we don't know the exact number, were all replaced in the armory to cover it all up. No record of this incident went into any of the logs, the daily reporting logs, like the journals for the base and the police, what we'd call in the Air Force a daily occurrence book. There was nothing put in there, and it was all covered up. Within days of that incident, she's so traumatized, she's flown back to the United States, never to be seen again.
Wow.
In terms of her Air Force career. Now, subsequently, I know roughly where she lives, what country she's living in. She's living in Europe, and I attempted through social media track down some of her relatives and sent messages to them, but they didn't respond. And I would imagine that she didn't want to get involved because it was such a traumatic incident. I hope that one day she does. She reads this book and says, I do want to tell my full story, but that's not happened yet. But I have no reason to disbelieve what Michael Stacey said to me, because it makes and fills in the blanks and perfectly plausible in light of part of the story that we knew. So again, think about this. Public road, run off the road, incident all covered up involving a US Air Force security police officer, an actual officer, a lieutenant, all of it covered up. You'd think it should be on the 6 o'clock news.
Yes.
The press aren't interested. They've done bits of the story, but they cover it on page 17, page 18. They get the details that I provide to them wrong. They just do lurid headlines, and the press don't treat it seriously. All right.
Gary, you've done a fascinating job of updating a 40-plus-year-old mystery with definitely new details. And the book is called Non-Human, The Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents. If anybody wants to read it for yourself.
Yeah, it's only available on Amazon because I self-published it. And interestingly, I did not do any pre-publicity because I did it as a forensic examination of the case, like a cold case review. And I took any sentiment out. I just provided the facts, laid out information on what I found over that period of 5 years, and laid it out. And most, well, all researchers are saying it's the definitive book on the case now, which is very humbling, and it gets excellent reviews. But I'm trying to see if I can find a proper publisher now, not a major publisher, to do a second edition because I've got some additional information. So,
Awesome.
but yes, thank you for having me as a guest, and I hope that's given you a bit more of an insight.
My mind's blown. Thank you so much.
It's a very complex case, and
Yes.
so much more.
Yes. Thank you.